10 springs, 1,000 acres of Cotswold limestone, and water that had been filtering through that ground for decades, cold and clear and completely invisible to the 46 million people who had watched Clarkson's farm by the time anyone thought to test it. Nobody thought to test it. That was the first mistake. The second mistake cost £44,000, produced 0 bottles, and ended in a government classification that described what Clarkson had been planning to sell to the British public as, in his own words, a lethal cocktail. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that makes this story unlike anything else in the Diddley Squat archive, is that not one documentary, not one deep dive video, not one farming journalist has ever covered it properly. The spring water story happened, it was filmed, it collapsed completely, and then the world moved on to the council battle, and the beer and the pub, and the water stayed buried, until now. And by the end of this, you will understand why this story matters far beyond one failed product on one Oxfordshire farm, and why the lesson it contains is the most expensive one in British food law that almost nobody learned. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this is the kind of stories channel exists to tell, and there are more of them coming. Diddley Squat sits on approximately 1,000 acres of West Oxfordshire farmland, purchased by Jeremy Clarkson in 2008 for £6 million at a time when he had no intention of farming it himself. The land is Cotswold limestone country. The topography is ancient, and beneath it, moving slowly through the rock at the pace that geology operates on, is water. Clean in the way that ground-filtered water is clean, cold in the way that deep source water is cold, and naturally pressurizing upward at 10 separate points across the property. 10 springs, not one, not a trickle behind the barn. 10 distinct natural springs spread across 1,000 acres of privately owned British farmland. Jeremy Clarkson, the son of a Paddington Bear toy salesman from Doncaster, looked at those 10 springs and did what Jeremy Clarkson does with every asset he discovers on that farm. He saw a product. Here is what he was not entirely wrong about. British premium water is a serious market. Highland Spring generates over £300 million annually. Harrogate water, sourced from a single Yorkshire spring, sells across the country in glass bottles at a significant premium. The brand logic is identical. Provenance, purity, place. A Cotswold spring on a famous farm with a television audience of millions is, on paper, precisely the kind of origin story that premium water brands spend decades and millions of pounds trying to manufacture. Clarkson already had it, sitting in the ground, free. The plan was straightforward: test the water, build a bottling operation, sell it in the farm shop alongside the honey and the candles and the egg-baked bread, add it to the product line. Put Diddley Squat on the label, charge a premium, move on. Stage 1 was the testing. Here is where it gets interesting. The government's drinking water standards, set under the natural mineral water, spring water, and bottled drinking water regulations, classify spring water not just by what is in it, but by how much of each element's safe parameters. Manganese, sulfates, sodium, each has a threshold. Each threshold exists because chronic exposure above that level carries documented health risk. These are not suggestions. They are legal limits. Clarkson's water came back high, not marginally high, high enough that when the results landed, he described the contents in the filmed episode as a lethal cocktail. Manganese above safe thresholds, sulfates elevated, sodium at concerning levels. The water filtering through that beautiful, ancient, television-famous Cotswold limestone was doing something to it on the way up that made it completely unfit for human consumption as bottled spring water. He pressed on anyway. This is the detail that changes everything. Because what most people assume, what the framing of the story invites you to assume, is that Clarkson discovered the water was toxic and stopped. He did not stop. He decided that the solution was engineering. Build a better pipe, control the contamination, fix the problem with infrastructure. He commissioned the construction of a bottling facility inside 2 welded together shipping containers. He designed and installed a pipe system to carry the water from the springs to the containers. He invested £44,000 in making this product real, and then the pipe system contaminated the water further. The infrastructure designed to solve the contamination problem introduced new contamination. The materials, the joints, the system that was supposed to clean the process up made it worse. At this point, The Food Standards Agency framework was not a distant threat, it was a legal wall. British spring water bottling law requires government-registered source protection. It requires specific approved pipe materials. It requires Food Standards Agency sign-off before a single bottle can leave the premises, not after launch. Before, the regulatory framework exists entirely at the front end, and Clarkson had built his entire back end, the containers, the pipes, the operation, before engaging with the front end at all. 0 bottles were ever sold. The entire project collapsed. Now, here's the part that almost nobody who covers this story has ever fully joined up. Because the water failure is not just a story about one bad product on one farm. It is a story about something structural, something that explains why British farming is in the state it is in, and why the gap between land that could produce and product that reaches shelf is so much wider in this country than almost anywhere else in the developed world. Stay with this, because what comes next is the part that makes the 44 tires zeros in look like the smallest number in the story. The spring water regulations in the United Kingdom are, by any objective measure, among the most rigorous in the world. They were designed reasonably to prevent the sale of contaminated water. They require source registration, hydrological surveys, protection zone mapping, and ongoing testing by accredited laboratories before a producer can legally call their product spring water. The process takes months, sometimes years. It requires specialist consultants most small farmers have never heard of and cannot easily find. This is not a story about bad regulation. The regulation exists for a reason. People have died from contaminated water sources. The system is not arbitrary. This is a story about a gap. The gap between what the land contains and what the law allows you to do with it. And the gap between what a farmer can see, 10 springs, clean to the eye, cold to the touch, flowing freely across land they own, and what a government classification system can detect when it applies its instruments. Clarkson could see the water, he could not see the manganese. And here is the counterintuitive truth that the regulators never intended to prove. The more precisely the law defines what water must be, the more it reveals how little farmers understand about what their own land produces. The Food Standards Agency did not set out to embarrass Clarkson. They set out to protect consumers. And in doing so, they demonstrated with devastating clarity that a man with money and cameras and a television audience and genuine commercial intent had no idea what was coming out of his own ground. Now consider what that means for the farmers without money, without cameras, without a television crew to document the collapse and an audience who will watch it anyway. The failure is the product. That is not a metaphor. It is the most precise description of what Clarkson's farm has always been. The farm loses money. The farm makes television. The television pays for the farm. Every collapse project, the lettuces, the sheep, the water, the planning permission is content. Every regulatory wall is an episode. Every 44 pound zeros and mistake is footage that Amazon pays 10 pounds to 12 million pounds a year for the right to broadcast. The water never launched, the story did. And this is where the counterintuitive logic of the entire enterprise becomes almost too sharp to look at directly. The Food Standards Agency, by making it impossible for Clarkson to sell his water, gave him something more valuable than a product. They gave him a villain. They gave him a storyline. They gave him proof. Filmed, documented, legally precise proof that the system governing British food production is so complex, so unforgiving, and so weighted against the small producer that even a man with every conceivable advantage cannot navigate it without failing. The regulators thought they were enforcing standards. They were funding the argument. What Clarkson understood, consciously or not, is that the British public has a complicated relationship with authority, with bureaucracy, and with the idea that someone with common sense and good intentions should be stopped from doing something logical by a framework they never had access to. The water story is not just relatable, it is politically charged in the most human way possible. He tried, he invested, he failed, not because the idea was bad, because the system was invisible until he hit it, and he hit it on camera. If you are finding this as valuable as I think you are, now is the time to subscribe and hit the bell, because next week we are going deep into another part of this story that has never been properly told, and you will not want to miss it. Here is the detail that competing videos missed entirely. The spring water failure was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern. The planning rejection for the farm shop, the restrictions on sourcing, the battle over the pub license. Every single obstacle that Clarkson encountered at Diddley Squat followed the same structural logic. The rules existed. They were not communicated in advance. They were discovered by collision. This is not unique to Clarkson. This is the lived experience of almost every small-scale food producer in Britain who has ever tried to move from raw material to retail product. The system assumes knowledge that it never provides. The farmer is expected to know, before investing, what they cannot know without investing. The 44,000 pounds in shipping containers and pipe systems is sitting in a field at Diddley Squat right now. 2 welded containers. A pipe system that made contaminated water more contaminated, a bottling operation that never bottled anything, and 10 springs still flowing, still cold, still completely unsellable under current law without a process that would cost more than the product could ever return at farm shop prices. That is not a farm problem. That is a system problem. And here is what makes it more interesting still. Clarkson, since the water failure, has not been quiet about it. The episode documenting the collapse was not cut or softened. It was broadcast in full, with the testing results, with the lethal cocktail line, with the containers, with the failed pipes. Amazon did not pull it. Clarkson did not minimize it. Because the failure, documented, public honest, does something that a successful product launch never could. It makes him credible. You cannot manufacture credibility. You can only find it and then point a camera at it. Every farmer watching that episode recognized the experience. Not the scale, not the television cameras, but the feeling. The feeling of standing next to something your land produces naturally and being told by a piece of paper from a government body that you cannot sell it. That feeling is not Clarkson's alone. It is the central emotional experience of British small-scale food production in the 21st century. He just had the cameras rolling when it happened. Stand back. Look at the full picture. 10 springs, 44,000 pounds invested, 0 bottles sold, 1 government classification toxic, 1 pipe system that made things worse, 1 bottling facility that never operated, and 1 television episode watched by millions of people who had never previously thought about the Food Standards Agency spring water regulations in their lives, and who came away from it with a precise, emotional, story-shaped understanding of exactly what those regulations do and who they affect. The water failed every regulatory test. The story passed every audience test. And here's the unresolved tension, because this story does not have a clean ending. The springs are still there. The contamination is geological. It comes from the limestone itself, from the natural mineral composition of the ground the farm sits on. This is not something Clarkson caused. It is not something engineering can permanently fix. The manganese is in the rock. The water will carry it as long as it moves through that rock, and the regulatory framework that governs what he can do with it has not changed. There is a version of this story where the technology improves, where affordable farm-scale filtration makes Diddley Squat spring water a viable product. There is a version where the regulations are reformed. There is a version where Clarkson revisits it, builds it properly, and launches it a decade after the first attempt. None of those versions exist yet. What exists is the story, filmed, broadcast, permanent, and now, finally, properly examined. The British food system has a gap between what the land produces and what the law allows you to sell. Clarkson did not create that gap. He walked into it with 44,000 pounds, 2 shipping containers, and a camera crew, and the gap became visible to 46 million people who had never seen it before. That is not a failed product. That is the most effective piece of farming advocacy made in Britain in a generation. And the government paid for it by saying no. If you have found this one rewarding, and I hope you have, do subscribe if you have not already, and have a look at the video on screen right now, which goes into another corner of the Diddley Squat story that I think you will find equally surprising. Drop a comment below. I am genuinely curious. Did you see the spring water episode when it aired? And did you realize at the time quite how much money had already gone into the ground before the cameras even started rolling? Thank you, as always, for watching.